of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the President's fiscal year 2025 budget request for the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be allowed to participate in today's hearing from the dais. Actually, we might be better off to name the people that aren't going on, that are not asking consent. But anyhow, the following members we ask consent to participate in today's hearing from the dais. Mr. Whitman, Dr. Gosar, Mr. Graves, Mr. Webster, Mr. Rosendale, Ms. Bolbert, Mr. Hunt, Mr. Collins, Mr. Duarte, Ms. Hageman, Mr. Huffman, Ms. Hoyle, Mr. Newhouse, Mr. Good, and Ms. Maliatakis. Without objection, so ordered. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3, Parent O. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Welcome, Director Stone-Manning and Director Sams, back to the committee to discuss the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management's budget request for fiscal year 2025. It is unsurprising, although still disappointing, that President Biden's budget is once again underwhelming. It features more of the same radical priorities, broken promises, and extreme proclamations that we've seen from this administration over the past 3 years. These priorities are out of line with the American people and the communities, families, and small businesses that live and operate closest to federal lands. With alarming consistency, these budget requests cater to environmental extremists at the expense of local communities who depend on access to federal lands for their way of life. They double down on the Biden administration's commitment to American prosperity and energy independence and pick winners and losers based on ideological concerns. The budgets allow unelected DC bureaucrats to enact their radical agendas without any accountability from the people they serve, all from the comfort of their home offices. The BLM has drifted so far from its mission that it has become unrecognizable. It's transforming into the Bureau of Land Mismanagement. Before me today are 8 rules and land use plans that the BLM recently published in the Federal Register. Together, they comprise 6,290 pages of rules and regulations that the BLM rushed to get out instead of meaningfully listening to and coordinating with local stakeholders. Only people happy with that stack out in flyover land in America are the paper mills. Each one of these documents claims to protect ecological and sensitive resources on federal lands. However, these are little more than thinly veiled attempts to lock up millions of acres of land from multiple uses and shirk the agency's statutory multiple use mandate. These rules and land use plans harm rural America, make us less energy independent, and threaten our national security. Today, we will address the shift away from congressionally mandated uses of the land to partisan priorities, which include a decrease in forest management to increase environmental justice efforts, a backlog of deferred maintenance that's allowed to grow out of control so the agencies can buy more electric vehicles, and ranchers, energy producers, and outdoor recreationists getting pushed off their lands so that they can be locked up indefinitely in the name of preservation. We'll also talk about the complete dereliction of duty the Department of Interior has committed with respect to federal lands along the southern border. If ecological and resource protections are so critical, then the agencies must address the enormous environmental degradation that is occurring at the southern border. Combined, the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management account for 53% of the federal land along the southern border. Trash from illegal immigrants, wildfires sparked by migrant campsites, an abundance of illegal trails, and the lack of safety for lawful visitors is astonishing. We would never accept this level of destruction and vandalism on our federal lands anywhere else in the country. So why is it acceptable on the southern border? Despite the increasing severity of the Biden border crisis, the word border appears just once in the context of the southern border in the BLM's entire 364-page budget request. The word climate appears 77 times, however, and the term environmental justice appears 11 times. Today, we will also address the administration's reckless spending, particularly the failure of the National Park Service to rein in the out-of-control deferred maintenance backlog. Earlier this year, this subcommittee heard testimony from Interior's Inspector General, who described the Park Service's accounting for deferred maintenance as akin to a house of cards built upon a house of cards. The fiscal year 2025 budget request does little to reassure Congress or the American people that these issues have been resolved, let alone taken seriously by the agency. It should also go without saying that after years of complaints from states across the nation saying they weren't having any projects funded, the Park Service would choose to spend $45 million updating Joe Biden's home. Well, that's the bad news. The good news is that we've recently passed a host of bills on the House floor with bipartisan support to reverse these troubling trends. They include the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act to secure mining in this country, the Alaska's Right to Produce Act, which reverses a harmful decision limiting oil and gas production in Alaska, the West Act to stop an illegal, vague rule that will upend the multiple uses of BLM land, the Superior National Forest Restoration Act, which would facilitate the permitting of a very important mine in Congressman Stauber's district. And finally, the Explore Act, which would cut red tape for small recreation businesses and improve outdoor access. Having Democrats join Republicans on each of these bills to stop the out-of-control, preservationist, and hurtful policies of the Biden administration should be a wake-up call. But I fear it won't be. Leadership in D.C. must listen to local stakeholders, engage meaningfully with communities, and above all, follow your mandatory coordination requirements. House Natural Resources Committee Republicans will continue holding the administration accountable, demanding answers, and when needed, passing legislation to stop harmful decisions. With that, I yield back and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neguse, for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman. I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here today for this important hearing. I'd be remiss if I just did not take one moment to note my strong disagreement with a number of statements made by the chairman. Only in Washington can colleagues of mine on the other side of the aisle rationally argue that the budget proposed to fund these incredibly important land management agencies are, I think the word that was used was underwhelming, after having voted against the appropriation bills that funded the very agencies that we're discussing today. Only in Washington. House Democrats have been working for years to appropriate sufficient resources so that the hardworking people at the BLM and the National Park Service can do the important work that they are statutorily authorized and compelled to do. So that the hardworking folks who are at the BLM in Colorado, just by way of example, the Western headquarters in Grand Junction, in my district, and across our great country, can continue doing their important work. It is shameful, in my view, that House Republicans, not all, certainly most members of this particular subcommittee, including the chairman, and most members of the full committee, have chosen a different course. I understand that they have disagreements with respect to particular priorities that the Biden administration is pursuing. That's their prerogative. But the caustic way in which these two agencies have been described by my colleagues, I think is deeply unfortunate. I, for one, am grateful to have both Director Sams from the National Park Service and Director Stone-Manning from the Bureau of Land Management here with us today to talk about the important missions of your respective agencies and the work that you are doing to be stewards for our national parks and our public lands. I want to say that, again, while I think we can argue, disagree, and discuss interpretations of the two management frameworks with respect to both of your agencies, and of course members of this subcommittee and the full committee have been doing so for decades. I am grateful for the work that you two are doing, and the Biden administration is doing more broadly, to manage our public lands with future generations in mind. I think that's important. I think it matters a great deal for our children, for my 5-year-old daughter, for future generations to come. It's the same approach that we took in the 117th Congress when I chaired this subcommittee. We worked to ensure that we would invest billions of dollars into the future of our public lands. And it's unfortunate, as I said, in my view, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have chosen a different course, have not scheduled a single hearing in this subcommittee, for example, to even discuss the climate crisis. I think that's unfortunate. Instead, they have done the opposite. They've pursued any number of policies that ultimately would put polluters over the people that we are here to serve. At BLM, Director Stone-Manning, your agency has advanced rules that ensure public lands are managed for the greater good, putting conservation on par with other uses and advancing a framework to promote renewable energy. Now, I don't know if in the stack of regulations here, this prop that the chairman has decided he'll use for this hearing, which I think is beneath this subcommittee, but nonetheless, I don't know if included in this package are the regulations pertaining to the Thompson Divide. I hope so, because I'll tell you that my constituents in Colorado are deeply grateful for the actions that the BLM took to protect the Thompson Divide. And as I said, while I recognize that we can have reasonable disagreements about the extent or propriety or depth of some of these particular policies and programs that the BLM and the NPS are implementing, I hope we can do so with a degree of respect for the witnesses who are here and for the agencies that they represent. I want to say thank you to both of you and your respective workforces, and I look forward to the conversation, and I yield back.
Thank you for the opening statement, Ranking Member Neguse. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany. Thank you, Director Sams and Director Stone-Manning for appearing before the committee today. As chairman of the Resources Committee, I've focused on advancing policies that achieve 4 primary objectives, and those are access, conservation, innovation, and transparency. When it comes to the Biden administration's policies and the proposed budget, it seems like there's almost an antithesis of these values. And instead of promoting access to our public lands, the administration is locking up millions of acres of land and resources, making it harder to produce energy, graze cattle, and feed our families. And we have to maintain and restore access. And I realize that there are forces above the levels that you all work in the federal government, and you're being good soldiers and doing your job in the positions that you're in. But for the sake of our federal lands, we need to actively manage them for multiple uses that they offer, whether that be energy development, outdoor recreation, timber harvesting, or wildlife habitat. And I'll state it again, conservation is an ethic. It's not a use, as this administration is trying to create a new lexicon. Conservation should be at the core of what we do, not a misinformed headline that has no substance but sounds good to the casual listener. Conservation has taken a hit in this administration, but the policies that we advance in this committee can help right the ship. This includes the West Act, which nullifies the BLM's public lands rule, as well as the Explore Act, which expands outdoor recreation access. Both of these pieces of legislation passed with bipartisan support earlier this year. While the budget is just a wish list that's never actually going to become law, we can't lose sight of the fact that policies concocted here in D.C. have a real effect on the local communities closest to those lands. I've seen that firsthand with the proposed renovations at the Buckstaff Bathhouse in my district. Originally, the Park Service proposed renovating the bathhouse in a manner that would lay off 37 employees. And I appreciate Secretary Holland and Director Sam's recent commitments to work with the Buck staff to ensure that we avoid that kind of an outcome. I look forward to hearing the testimony today and look forward to hearing the questions. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now move on to witness testimony. I'd like to remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, press the on button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. At the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red. And I'll ask you to please complete your statement. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Tracy Stone-Manning, Director of the Bureau of Land Management. Director Stone-Manning, you have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman, Chairman Tiffany, Ranking Member Neguse, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Tracy Stone-Manning, the Director of the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the fiscal year 2025 budget priorities and the mission of the BLM. We are the nation's largest land manager, responsible for 1 in 10 acres in this country. The multiple use, sustained yield mission established by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, directs us to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of 245 million acres of public lands and 700 million acres of mineral estate for multiple uses. These lands provide food, fiber, minerals, energy, clean water, habitat, and lifetime memories for countless families. We owe a great deal of gratitude to the nearly 10,000 BLM civil servants that do the hard work of balancing our mission day in and day out. In fiscal year 22, public lands managed by the BLM supported $262 billion in economic output and 1 million jobs. In addition, last year, public lands generated more than $9.6 billion in revenue. The country's economic return on its investment in the BLM is remarkable. For each dollar Congress provided us in fiscal year 23, we generated $6 in revenue, 6 to 1. And of course, this return does not consider how we pay forward to the future in our work to conserve, protect, and restore public lands and waters for the benefit of current and future generations. The President's fiscal year 25 budget request of $1.6 billion ensures that we can meet our multiple use and sustained yield responsibilities under FLPMA. While the budget request advances many important administration priorities, I'll focus on 2, prioritizing landscape health and resilience and the transition to a clean energy economy. The budget request proposes continued investments to prioritize the health and resilience of public lands and waters that are increasingly facing impacts of climate change, including prolonged drought, increased spread of invasive weeds, and more frequent and intense wildland fires. The budget requests $317.4 million to improve the health of public lands through restoration efforts, including eradicating and controlling invasive species and reestablishing native plant communities. Each of the landscape health activities supported by the budget request is key in supporting the multiple use and sustained yield of our public lands into the future, helping to improve the health and resilience of public lands and conserve important wildlife habitat as we facilitate responsible development. That approach of managing so that present and future generations can enjoy the benefits of our public lands is a through line in all of our work and in the rulemakings we've recently finalized. How we approach the future of energy is also central in that work. President Biden has asked us to ensure an electricity sector free of carbon pollution by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050, and our public lands play an important role in that effort. The budget proposes $53 million to support siting, leasing, and oversight of renewable energy projects and transmission lines on public lands, which provide excellent solar, wind, and geothermal energy potential. During this administration, the BLM has approved over 7.3 gigawatts of renewable energy projects, helping to surpass the administration's goal of permitting 25 gigawatts of clean energy projects on public lands by 2025. We also lease lands in solar energy zones that will yield another 2 gigawatts. To help foster the work, the BLM published the final renewable energy rule earlier this month, which will lower consumer energy costs, improve project application processes, and incentivize developers to continue responsibly developing solar and wind projects on our public lands. While the BLM has made great progress transitioning to the clean energy future, oil and gas production continues to be a substantial part of the BLM's energy portfolio. Our work has ensured that conventional energy development is as environmentally responsible as possible and that it provides a fair return to the American taxpayer. To that end, BLM recently published the first comprehensive update to the onshore oil and gas leasing regulations in many decades. This update implements congressional direction in the Inflation Reduction Act and will help protect critical wildlife habitat, cultural resources, and recreation. We also finalized a rule to ensure that we reduce the wasteful practice of venting or flaring natural gas. Both of these efforts are key in helping to modernize the oil and gas program and ensuring it's fair to the American taxpayer for whom the BLM stewards our public lands. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Director Stone-Manning. I'd now like to recognize Representative Bentz to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's my privilege to introduce my friend, Director Chuck Sams, today. Director Sams is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Northeast Oregon and is a constituent of mine in Congressional District 2. He served as Executive Director for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. He's a U.S. Navy veteran where he served as an intelligence specialist. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Concordia University and a Master of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma School of Law. Prior to his appointment to Director of the National Park Service, he served as Oregon Governor Kate Brown's appointee to the Pacific Northwest Power and Conservation Council. I was proud to support his confirmation as Director of the National Park Service. Welcome, Director Sams. I yield back.
Mr. Sams, you have 5 minutes.
Nick Maitsky. Thank you, Chair Mesterman, for meeting with me earlier. Thank you, Chair Tiffany and Ranking Member Nagoose for having me here today. Thank you, Congressman Bentz. It's always nice to see somebody from home, especially Eastern Oregon. I also want to thank the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear before you on the fiscal year 2025 budget request for the National Park Service. I'd like to summarize my testimony and submit my entire statement for the record. The discretionary budget request for the National Park Service is $3.6 billion, an increase of $251.3 million compared to fiscal year 2024 enacted funding. I want to highlight for you a few critical components. The fiscal year 2025 budget proposes $15.1 million in increased investments to advance racial justice and equity for underserved communities, including the strengthening of nation-to-nation relationships with tribes. This includes an additional $3 million for expanded tribal co-stewardship of park resources, $1.5 million to increase tourism that benefits tribes, $2.5 million in dedicated funding for tribal heritage grants, and $1 million for management of subsistence uses of National Park Service lands and waters in Alaska. The initiative also invests in new parks that expand access and tell important stories, like the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument, the Somerton site expansion of Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Park, and the Amachi National Historic Site. Through these efforts, we intend to create greater opportunities for underserved communities to enjoy and engage in their national parks. The fiscal year 2025 request also invests $180 million in support of operational needs. The National Park Service has lost almost 15% of its operational capacity since fiscal year 2010. Over the same period, over 35 units have been added to the National Park System, and annual visitation has increased by tens of millions. This new funding includes $46 million in support of the proposed 2025 employee pay raise, as well as the $105.8 million in baseline capacity due to the absorption of the 2024 pay increases that eroded parks' purchasing power. And to help meet this growth in operational demand, the budget seeks $11.2 million to address new and critical responsibilities across parks and offices, such as addressing significant physical security issues at Mount Rushmore National Memorial and providing increased resource and visitor protection at Stonewall National Monument. The fiscal year 25 budget also proposes $6.8 million in wage grade and locality adjustments to support required increases in personnel expenses and $10 million to restore staff capacity lost in fiscal year 24. Also, to help prevent the growth of deferred maintenance, the request proposes $193.2 million for cyclic maintenance, a $5 million increase over fiscal year 2024. This funding supports projects that address routine maintenance and recapitalization needs and contributes to the National Park Service's approach towards life cycle investments that sustain assets in the long term. Lastly, the budget proposes to invest more than $100 million across fund sources for housing needs. The National Park Service has more than 5,600 housing units across 213 parks that house more than 15,000 people. While many of these units are in good condition, many have deferred maintenance and modernization needs, and the market for housing in gateway communities around parks is rapidly changing. There has been an increase in both the cost of housing as well as the use for vacation rentals, leading to a lack of affordable and available housing for park employees in these communities. In areas that have seen significant increases in housing costs, housing is a common factor cited in job offer declinations, and some staff have been lost due to the housing challenge. We take the responsibility of providing sufficient housing to our employees seriously. Therefore, the budget also includes an increase of $9 million to construct, improve, and modernize housing for National Park Service employees. This funding increase will support compliance, design, and construction of housing units that will replace obsolete and deteriorating housing or add housing capacity at multiple parks, including at Rocky Mountain National Park, Sequoia and Kings Canyon Park, and Mammoth Cave National Park. Finally, I'm pleased to update you on our progress to implement the Great American Outdoors Act. Funding from the Legacy Restoration Fund has provided us almost $3.9 billion for deferred maintenance. We have obligated more than $2.1 billion with over 131 projects underway and more starting this year. From the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the National Park Service has received more than $395 million for land acquisition activities and over $1 billion for state grant programs matched by non-federal funds for a total impact of at least $2 billion. Chairman, this concludes my summary. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your continued support of the National Park Service, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Director Sams. We'll now move on to questioning at this point, and I'm going to begin the questioning here of our witnesses. Director Sams, your agency manages 195 miles of land along the southern border. Have you visited the southern border in your capacity as director?
Yes, sir. I most recently, last year, went and visited Saguaro National Park and was able to talk about border issues, both with the Tohono O'odham tribe and with my staff.
And have you seen the impact of the garbage that is being dropped at the southern border by illegal immigrants?
I am very concerned about that same thing, sir, and I thank you for the question. Yes, we are very aware of the amount of impact we are seeing on the southern border with the amount of trash. We work continually to ensure the safe environment for our visitors down there and for staff alike in working to resolve those issues.
Director Stone-Manning, your agency manages 173 miles of land on the southern border. Have you visited the southern border as a director?
Congressman, I have.
You have visited, and have you seen the environmental devastation that's going on the southern border like I have?
Congressman, I didn't see a lot of trash. I did see some cleanup work necessary from the previous administration's construction projects.
Oh, I see. It was the previous administration's fault that there's 193 tons of garbage that have been dropped on the federal lands. Is that what you're saying?
No, Congressman, I'm saying I didn't witness that trash.
You didn't witness that trash?
I didn't.
I would recommend, I've seen it a couple times when I've been down to Arizona, including recently in the last, it was about a month and a half ago. And so in your opening statement, you say that you're, one of the things that you seek to do is to conserve and protect the environment of the Bureau of Land Management lands that you manage. Is that preserving and protecting them by allowing this dumping of waste on the BLM lands and then not picking it up?
Yeah, Congressman, there's no doubt that illegal trash dumping is a problem all across our public lands. I just met yesterday with some folks from New Mexico, the Tesuque Pueblo, who is very concerned about the amount of trash on the Kaha. Idaho has a Don't Dump on Idaho PSA campaign running. It's unfortunately a real problem all across our public lands with people disrespecting them, and we're doing as much as we can to ensure that we stop that behavior.
You're doing as much as you can. How many dollars did you allocate for this in the Bureau of Land Management budget?
Congressman, I don't have that number before me.
I do. 0. You put $0. So it's a priority, but you don't put any money towards it. Is that what you're saying?
Congressman, we pick up hundreds and thousands of pounds of garbage every year on our public lands.
Have you met with Secretary Mayorkas about this?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that question.
Have you met with Secretary Mayorkas about this problem?
I have not met the secretary.
So when you appeared for confirmation before the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Senator Barrasso asked the following question. If I'm confirmed as, or you made the following statement, if I am confirmed as BLM Director, I will work with the Department of Homeland Security and other relevant departments, agencies as appropriate to address border-related issues on the public lands. It's now been 951 days since you were confirmed. Were you lying to Senator Barrasso and the Senate when you said that you were, confirmed that you were going to work with Homeland Security to deal with this problem?
Congressman, I know the many BLM staff who dedicate their work day in and day out along our southern border work daily with the Department of Homeland Security.
But you haven't.
I have not had direct interaction with the secretary, who's a very busy man.
So the Director of Bureau of Land Management, 173 miles of southern border lands, and this is not a priority with nearly 200 tons of trash being dropped as a result of illegal immigration, and you're supposed to be preserving and protecting our best lands in the United States of America?
Congressman, it's a really important issue all across our public lands, and our staff works on it each and every day.
Director Sams, how much is an electric vehicle? How much does it cost to buy an electric vehicle?
It depends on the type. If we're talking light utility vehicle or just a car, it can cost anywhere between $25,000 to as much as $80,000.
Kelly Blue Book says on average it's about $54,000. Does that sound about right?
Yes, sir.
How much is the National Park Service proposing for the Southwest Border Resource Protection Program?
Approximately $1 million.
$1 million?
Yes, sir.
How much is that an increase?
About $8,000, sir.
So about $8,000 more. But the budget includes $4.2 million for electric vehicles?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the electric vehicles are more important than our southern border?
Oh, we're not saying that at all, sir.
I will yield back. I've exceeded my time. And next, I will turn to the ranking member, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to shift gears entirely, and I'm first going to say it's nice to see Director Stone-Manning, Director Sams. Thank you for all your good work. Really appreciate everything you're doing for so many critical initiatives to help protect our public lands, promote domestic clean energy production, and provide outdoor recreation opportunities. I want to take a moment to commend you and the administration for advancing historic action on climate change and conservation, commensurate with what this moment demands. Director Stone-Manning, I'd like to begin with you and speak about legislation I've introduced with Representative Caston, Ranking Member Grijalva, and many of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle, the Clean Electricity and Transmission Acceleration Act. This legislation includes an entire title to improve renewable energy development on federal public lands, which mirrors my standalone bill, the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act. And since we're talking about appropriations for the agency today, at least I think that's why we're supposed to be here, I want to dive into a specific piece of the legislation, which is revenue sharing. Director Stone-Manning, is it true that a portion of the receipts from oil and gas rents and fees for drilling permits are automatically reinvested in a special permit processing program?
It is.
And per the BLM's budget justification, this program is just for oil and gas permitting improvement, not renewable energy permitting improvement. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. It's my understanding that this program, known as the Permit Processing Improvement Fund, has in some cases helped BLM to better staff certain field offices where applications to drill for oil and gas are most concentrated, so the agency can process permits in a timely manner. But when it comes to renewable energy, there's no such Permit Processing Improvement Fund, is there?
That's correct.
And legislation would be necessary to create one, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. So right now, 100% of the revenues from acreage rents, megawatt capacity fees, bonus bids, and other fees from renewable energy development on public lands just go straight back to Treasury. But I think that this current structure misses out on a very important opportunity. So my bills, both CETA and Plurita, include a provision to split these revenues 4 ways between states, counties, permit processing, and conservation efforts paired with recreational access. Director Stone-Manning, according to your testimony, as of April 2024, there are 65 utility-scale renewable energy projects under review by BLM, representing more than 32 gigawatts of potential capacity to power millions of homes and create thousands of jobs. Can you speak to how mandatory funding for wind and solar permit processing could help your agency tackle all of these applications?
Congressman, thanks for the question. Not only would it help the BLM staffers who are hard at work every day with big stacks of projects on their desks, but I think it would also be very important to the local communities in which these projects are placed. It would mirror the oil and gas program so that local counties and states could receive revenue from the great power that we are generating from hot water and the sun and wind.
So I'm correct in understanding that federal revenue from oil and gas leasing is partially dispersed to the states where production is located. That's right?
That's correct.
And the same is not true for renewable energy production on public lands.
That's correct.
So I think at the very least, we ought to ensure that the federal government treats wind and solar on par with oil and gas. Oil and gas revenues shared with communities, reinvested in permit processing, all while the fossil fuel companies are making record profits and they're enjoying structural benefits. They continue to enjoy structural benefits in our system that have been built in over the last century. I'd like to enter into the record a white paper from Harvard discussing these issues more in depth. And just in closing, Director Stone-Manning, I really appreciate all you and your team are doing to try to level the playing field with the 2 rules that your agency has finalized, but there's clearly more to be done legislatively. I'm committed to ensuring that happens so that responsible wind and solar development can happen at scale, and I hope to work with my colleagues to bring parity to our energy resources and balance the use of our public lands so that generations to come can continue to enjoy them. And with that, I yield back.
Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent to enter that into the record?
I'd love unanimous consent to enter this into the record, Mr. Chairman.
It's so ordered.
Thank you, sir.
Now we turn to Representative Lamborn for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Sams, I totally appreciate our national parks. I've been to 300 units of the national park system. Recently, Secretary Holland testified in front of this committee, and in Colorado alone, where I have my congressional district, there is a deferred maintenance backlog and repairs that total $558 million. I asked her specifically if NPS is considering looking to the concession industry to support any of these important capital investment needs. Has she spoken to you about this, and can you answer where NPS is in leveraging the concessionaire industry? Concessionaires are willing to make long-term investments if NPS has the vision to utilize this resource.
Thank you, Congressman. The Secretary and I have spoken about this before, and we see our concessionaires exactly as that, helping with capitalization. They've done a wonderful job across the service in helping us really protect some of our more iconic buildings, everything from the hotels at Yosemite and Yellowstone and everywhere in between. So I've had some really great discussions with several of our concessionaires about that and what that looks like, and we look forward to continuing to partner with them in that opportunities to do that capitalization.
Oh, thank you. And I was pleased to see that the rulemaking process earlier this year finalized a rule that updates the contracting process for concessionaires. I'm concerned about transparency, and will you commit to making sure there's even more transparency in this process going forward?
I welcome the opportunity to work with you on that transparency issue. What I'm trying to make sure is we're modernizing our business practices, which is one of 7 of my initiatives that I've laid out before the staff. That is one of them, ensuring that it's very transparent. But if you see any issues in that, happy to work with you and your staff.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And Director Stone-Manning, I'd like to ask you some questions about the so-called Landscape and Conservation Health Rule, which refers to mitigation and restoration leases. These have no acreage limits, and I'm concerned, how will BLM determine an adequate price per acre for these mitigation and restoration leases?
Congressman, thank you for the question. What these mitigation and restoration leases are going to be enable us to do is ensure that investment can come onto public lands to restore them so that they are healthy for future generations. We're currently working on guidance on what kind of rents we would charge for those and what they would cost.
Will they be paying royalties like oil and gas leases currently do?
Congressman, no, they will be charged rent and there will be bonding.
Okay. Now, what mechanism is in place to ensure that environmentalists, including some of the extreme groups out there, will use their 501c3s to generate massive donation-based funding to lock up tens or hundreds of thousands of acres of land?
Congressman, again, I need to be clear. These leases are not going to lock up land. Other uses will be available and allowed on the leases that are compatible. And we'll use the same adjudication process for all of our rights-of-ways that we use for all of our rights-of-ways, we'll use for leases. And that stems from 43 CFR 2920.
Okay. Now, the BLM's Fluid Mineral and Leasing Rule establishes a preference criterion for leases. Where do mitigation and restoration leases rank in this criterion, in this order of priority?
Congressman, valid existing rights on leases will go forward. So if there's a valid existing right out there, we've got 10 million acres that are currently leased but not being used. That right would hold over the restoration or the mitigation. We would look elsewhere to put a restoration and mitigation lease.
Now, BLM has stated that these leases are only going to be necessary until the land has been restored to a usable condition. What will be the measurement criteria that defines when the land has been returned to a usable condition?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We do assessment and inventorying and monitoring as part of our daily work to have a real understanding of the ecosystems in which we work. It'll be science and data that drive the answer to that question.
Okay, lastly, on a slightly different subject, BLM, or under the Biden administration, we have not had lease sales except for one in Colorado in the last 3 years. Will you commit to holding a lease sale on the western slope this year in Colorado?
Congressman, it's my understanding that due to litigation, we have not been leasing on the western slope because so much of it is tied up in litigation.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Now recognize Ms. Porter for 5 minutes.
People love our national parks. Republicans, kids, adults. Some of our greatest national treasures are parks, not only for the natural beauty they provide, but also for the history that they preserve. Director Sams, do you know of anyone who hates the national parks? Have you encountered people like that in your service?
I have not, Madam Congresswoman, not at all.
I have not either. But sadly for all of us, our national parks have been increasingly harmed by wildfire. California has seen devastating wildfires in the last decade in our national parks. Forests have been destroyed. Wildlife has been vanquished, relocated, and historic structures have burned. And I want to show people what this looks like. These are tragic images. We should all be able to agree that these are tragic images. And we all know now, I want to be clear about this, we all understand that fires are to a certain extent an essential part of forest management. They're a natural part of forest management. But we want our parks to be resilient. Mr. Sams, can you tell me just yes or no? Does the National Park Service have a fire resilience plan to address situations like this?
Yes, we do.
You do. Of course you do. Of course you do, because everyone loves the national parks and nobody wants to see these kinds of harms. Mr. Sams, what's the one big thing that Congress can do to help aid wildfire resilience? When we see these images, when our constituents see these images, what do they need their representatives to do?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Additional resources. The national
Money. Let me just stop you right there, because I'm going to ask you what you're going to do with the money in just a minute, but I want to be really clear. Money. They don't need us suiting up and showing up trying to fight the fire. Social media posts don't put out wildfires or replant forests. They need money. Congress can provide the resources. Now, fortunately, last Congress, thanks to Democrats and President Biden, we passed two laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and there were Republicans who supported that, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Each law invests $5 billion into federal wildland fire management. This is because, just like I said, people love parks, and we want them to be open. Mr. Sams, how is the money that you said you need and that Congress has allocated, how are you using that to restore national parks that have been harmed by wildfires?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We've been allocated $105 million from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for fuels reduction and post-fire restoration and rehabilitation activities that will mitigate the damaging effects of the wildfires and set landscapes on a path towards natural recovery and climate resilience. This includes planting of native and non-native species to restore or establish healthy, stable ecosystems and reestablishing burned habitat and reestablishing native trees lost in the fire.
So you're putting these dollars to great use. You've led a major effort to restore, for example, historic sequoia trees in the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park in California that burned in 2020 and 2021. I've been there myself, unable repeatedly to visit Kings Canyon because it is still being affected by fire and storms. How exactly does investing in these efforts promote wildfire resilience? So you've talked about kind of repairing and restoring, but how about making things more resilient?
The funding helps us really look at how we're moving forward in the face of climate change. What are the species of plants that were out there? In my own experience in working with tribes and understanding indigenous knowledge and how we've used that, we as American Indians have seen climate change over the last 30,000 years happen at least 3, if not 4 times. And we have enough knowledge and understanding of what we can do to help build a more resilient future.
So can you continue to do this work without the $105.3 million? Can you do this just by waving a wand? Is there a way to do this without spending money?
Absolutely not. We need the funding in order to be able to combat this issue.
And Mr. Sams, can you tell me which political party proposed a budget that would cut funding for wildfire resilience?
Ma'am, it was the Republican side.
It was not the Biden administration. Their budget has these funds in it. So when we look at these pictures, like most Americans, what I feel is I feel love for our national parks and recreation lands, and I feel a desire to protect them. But apparently not House Republicans. They look at these pictures and they don't seemingly feel anything at all. They just see an opportunity to attack our national parks. When we cut funding, we are hurting parents who have saved all year to take their kids or grandkids camping. We are devastating our recreation economies, and we're putting lives at risk. Fully funding the National Park Service and BLM, protecting those investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it is critical to the survival of our parks. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize the chairman, Mr. Westerman, for his question.
Thank you, Chairman Tiffany, and I want to echo my colleague from California's concern on wildfire and for the sequoias, and remind you, we've got a bipartisan bill called the Save Our Sequoias Act. We'd love to have you on that. And also, if we would do a little bit more management, we wouldn't have to spend so much money on wildfires and the damage that they do. It's really a great example of how an ounce of prevention is worth many, many pounds of cure when it comes to our forest. But Director Sams, good to see you again. I enjoyed our meeting last week with some of my folks from Arkansas with the Department of Parks, Heritage, and Tourism with Secretary Lewis, Heritage Division Director Ryle, and First Gentleman Brian Sanders to discuss outdoor recreation opportunities in Arkansas and to talk about the ways the state can partner with the National Park Service on promoting tourism and how states and the federal land agencies could work together and benefit both. Now, as we discussed, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, I know we had a chance to talk about the Buckstaff Bathhouse, and that may sound like a pet project because it's one in the national park in my hometown, but it's also concerning to know that there were plans to shut down a facility that would cause 37 people to lose their jobs. And this bathhouse has been open since 1912, the Buckstaff has. So I know you were going to look into that. I just wanted to get an update to see if you can tell me if we're going to be able to, those folks are going to be able to keep their job and maybe do a little different planning on how to install the HVAC, which is obviously needed and appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening the meeting last week. It was a pleasure to meet several of your folks from your home state and have discussions with them, and I've met several of them before, and even through social media, we continue to visit with each other to talk about what a wonderful asset we have there for folks to enjoy. We are continuing to work on that issue to figure out how best to ensure that we are not going to lose that staff, including discussion even now whether how much longer we can extend that particular concessionaire's contract. We'll continue. We've not gone out for a total bid yet to talk about who we're going to end up working with, especially on the HVAC system, to determine how we can do a workaround so that folks can continue to do their work.
Yeah, so as an engineer in my former life, I can tell you there's multiple ways to do that, and I'm pretty sure people put HVAC systems in before without having to lose their whole workforce. Now, turning to a different direction, and we've talked a lot about Floyd Bennett Field. I made a trip up there, met with your colleagues on that Park Service facility, and maybe I'm not too good at reading people, but I think I could see in the faces of those folks up there that they weren't real happy about making their national park a migrant shelter. And I really believe that was way above the level of the Park Service. I believe that decision was made way above the level of the Interior Department. The more we research this, the more that it appears it was Department of Homeland Security working directly with the White House that forced this migrant shelter to be built on Park Service land. And amazingly, we saw our so-called bedrock environmental laws waived within a week or two so that this construction could happen. Now, I know that lease ends on September 14th of this year. Can you commit to not renewing that lease, or is that above your level of commitment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Within the lease, it does allow for a one-year extension of that lease, but I can assure you I'm currently in no discussions or negotiations with the city of New York about that extension at this time.
So can you commit that no other national parks are turned into migrant encampments?
Mr. Chairman, I know that you've asked for a lot of information on this, and we're provided that. I don't have the most current information in front of you, but I'm happy to get back to you on that particular question.
As the weather's getting nicer and local New Yorkers are looking to get outside and use recreational sites and facilities, including the beach at Floyd Bennett Field, can you commit to at least increasing the police presence there at this site to ensure the safety of local residents?
Under the lease agreement, we've been able to add additional patrols from the U.S. Park Police who are helping on those issues and providing security and safe enjoyment of the park. It is specifically under the lease New York City Police Department's responsibility for the migrant camp itself. But we will continue to ensure that all of our visitors are safe within our parks.
So there have been there have been multiple arrests at the Floyd Bennett Field facility, for instance, ranging from assault to domestic violence. Since those reports have come out, what has the Park Service done to protect the safety of Park Service employees and local residents?
For the latest data, I can't speak, Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to it directly, and I'm happy to talk to you in more detail and provide you written information about where we're at in that. But I recognize that just from the information I have received from my park police is that it's mostly around unregistered cars that we're seeing and some minor petty stuff, but I'm happy to get you a more detailed report.
All right, I'd like to see that. Also, included in the priority project request under the Great American Outdoors Act for the National Park Service, there was $40 million in repairs for the Gateway National Recreation Area, which includes Floyd Bennett Field. Will putting 2,000 migrants at Floyd Bennett Field impact the timeline of completing this work?
Thank you. I don't believe it will at this time. Those projects are part of our deferred maintenance package that have been on for a long time and made the business case, and we will continue to work forward to ensure that those investments are placed in the park for everyone's enjoyment.
And Mr. Chairman, I thought the clock was going the other way. I yield back the microphone because I'm way out of time. Thank you for indulging.
Chairman yields, and now I recognize Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I need to offer a word in response to the opening statement by the ranking member. He obsesses over a 1-degree increase in global temperatures over the next century, but he couldn't care less that the Democrats' policies are making it harder and harder for families to afford to heat their homes, purchase groceries, or drive their cars to work, or even have work to drive to. These policies are madness, and they're now having a terrible effect on the prices that Americans have to pay for everything from gasoline and electricity to automobiles and light bulbs. Europeans are already waking up to this lunacy, and I think Americans will soon follow. I also need to respond to Ms. Porter. I'd remind her that half the forests in California are privately owned. The private forests are healthy, resilient, and fire-resistant because their owners manage their forests and match the timber density to the ability of the land to support it. And they make money doing that. We need to do the same thing. We used to. You know, a fourth of the funds from federal timber auctions used to go to local communities that were that were affected by the forest, and the other 75% went to the Forest Service to manage our forests. The environmental laws of the 1970s now require an average of 4.5 years of studies before we can undertake a forest thinning project. They cost millions of dollars, more than the value of the timber to be harvested. So private landowners keep their lands in excellent condition and they make money. Federal land managers have kept our forests in decrepit condition under these laws, and they lose money. That's not the fault of taxpayers for not paying enough taxes. That's the fault of the very policies that my friend from California has spent her career advocating. In fact, according to a recent UCLA study, the 2020 wildfires in California released twice as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as all of the CO2 reductions that they imposed in that state between 2003 and 2019 combined, and at a staggering cost to taxpayers and consumers and employees. Now, Mr. Sams, I have Yosemite National Park in my district, and I want to address management issues there that are a continuing nightmare for park visitors, and they've become an economic disaster for the gateway communities that depend on park visitation. Crowding exists in the valley, but the valley isn't the sole destination for visitors, yet the reservation system doesn't make this distinction, nor does it distinguish between peak visitation periods and slack periods. And far worse, it makes it impossible for spontaneous trips to the park by those in the general region. Now, in a memo to your management there at Yosemite, the gateway businesses noted the experience with the reservation's problem. And here's some of the things they noted. Uncertainty regarding access for those who want to visit Yosemite from out of state or internationally, and the existence of a ticketing system inhibiting visitation generally, ticket hoarding by locals, complexity, confusion, and frustration for visitors, unfairly advantaging large properties inside the park, a greater congestion at entry gates, and rigidity and inability to respond to real-time events based on actual demand pressure. These are what the locals have actually observed there. Now, I've written to you to ask that the Park Service not finalize the reservation system until other alternatives are explored. And as I wrote to you a month ago, Rather than seeing what pressure points remain, the pilot system is overly onerous and restrictive to the public in several areas, which will mask opportunities to create a more appropriate, minimal, public-friendly, long-term solution. So what are you doing to take this into account?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And yes, this is a huge issue across the service as we see more and more folks wanting to come to their parks. And we're trying to work very hard and recognizing that, of course, what works at one park may not work at another. What
you're doing at Yosemite is not working, and yet you don't seem to be taking that into account in plowing ahead. You know, I've got to tell you candidly that the gateway communities feel the current park management is entirely insulated and disinterested in their input and feedback. In fact, when I met with them a few months ago, the park management was invited to attend, but instead they blew us off. A few years ago, I took note of a sign in the conference room at Yosemite. It posed the question, is it good for the park? Well, I suggested then, and I repeat today, that that's precisely the wrong question. The right question is it good for the park's visitors? And I'll tell you, my assessment is that this is an attitude problem that runs deep in the Park Service. And if you can't correct it, we're going to need to find somebody who can. The best visitor experience that's been reported to me at Yosemite over the years that I've represented it came during the shutdown during the Trump administration. Now, during the Obama shutdown, the Park Service canceled all events, it ordered all businesses to be shuttered, it chained all the entrances, it even blocked turnouts overlooking the valley so people couldn't even stop to get a glimpse of the park from afar. Now, during the Trump shutdown, however, the park gates were kept open, concessionaires continued to operate, and except for a brief period when the concessionaire had to arrange for alternative trash collections, visitors reported that they had a much better, hassle-free experience without the Park Service being on duty. Now, what does it say about the park management when their absence leads to a better visitor experience than their presence?
Thank you for the question. Well, first and foremost is that we ended up having to do a lot of remediation because during that time period, and we're continuing to do that remediation. Last summer, I had the good chance of enjoying some of Yosemite and seeing how many folks come in and truly enjoy it. The balance under the Organic Act, of course, is how do we protect these cultural and natural resources while ensuring that it's open for the enjoyment of the American public. It is a very tough balancing act that we're looking at, and we want to work very closely with the gateway communities, with your counties, and with you.
That is simple, empty rhetoric. I'm telling you that your management is not, and that's the experience of these gateway communities, and it's a growing frustration. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now turn to the representative from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the witnesses for their presence today. Director Stone-Manning, I have a bunch of questions, no surprise, given the size of my district, some 46 million acres, 73,000 square miles, a huge portion of which is Bureau of Land Management managed. I want to start with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and in it there are a number of refinements, amendments to NEPA, and I'm just anxious to know if the BLM has initiated rulemaking to incorporate those new timeframes for your NEPA work. Have you initiated rulemaking in that regard?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. We have issued guidance on ensuring that we meet those new timelines of a year for an EA and 2 years for an EIS, and also the page limits within.
If you would be so kind as to provide me with that guidance, I would appreciate it. Yep. The second question, the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, I think you now have management duties, authority over it. And of course, it's in my district. And I've been speaking with some of the ranchers who have grazing permits on that space. And they have been notified that their leases that they've many times had for decades will not be renewed. Is that your understanding?
Congressman, we're right in the middle of a resource management plan for Cascade-Siskiyou, and of course that's a transparent and open and public process. And I'm assuming and hoping that your constituents engage in that process.
Well, that does not answer the question. Of course they've engaged, and they've said we don't want our permits not renewed. So my question to you is, will their permits be renewed under any circumstances?
Congressman, the proclamation that established that national monument allows for grazing.
Say that again.
The proclamation that established that monument allows for grazing.
Okay, so I read the proclamation pretty carefully. I didn't see that in it. So you're telling me, and I'm very happy to hear it, that if it allows for grazing, that's really good news. It's not in the proclamation.
Then I stand corrected.
Yeah, well, I'm happy for what you're doing. Don't get me wrong. I want those permits renewed. So yeah. So the conservation rule, it came up a little earlier, and I think you used the word compatible. It's odd because that conservation rule suggests that it's on par, conservation, with the other multiple uses. But I would suggest what that does is give the agency authority to, I hate to call it without regard to rules, to do whatever it would like. Do you read it that way? Because if you look at it, if you think about it for a moment, conservation being a preservation sort of a thing, it seems to be the exact opposite of, shall we say, any extractive activity, whether it's grazing or logging or mining. Tell me how you reconcile the obvious difference between conservation on the one hand and an extractive activity on the other.
Congressman, thank you for the question, and you've gotten right to the heart of why our work is difficult and engaging, the multiple-use mission. And the Federal Land Policy and Management Act has been clear, it's explicitly clear, that multiple use includes managing for recreation, watersheds, fish and wildlife habitat, and natural, scenic, and cultural values. It establishes conservation as a use, and what this rulemaking does is put some consistency in how we lift up that portion of FLTMA to ensure that future generations, 30, 40, 50 years from now, get to enjoy our public lands the way that we do today.
So I haven't heard the answer to my question. If these are opposite uses, then how in the world can you have, how will you ever find compatibility? Because that's just, you're saying that indeed you could have mining and at the same time conservation.
The other thing that FLTMA tells us is that we don't have to have all the uses on every single acre. So a hard rock mine is a great example. We're not going to have recreation and mountain biking
Excuse
in
me
an
for
open
interrupting.
pit.
That's not the way I read your rule. I read your rule as imposing upon all activities, multiple use or not, this conservation overlay. But if I'm wrong, please provide me with the data so indicating. I want to go to the ONC lands, over which you have management control. For years, the ONC lands have not been producing the amount or allowed to produce the amount of timber that the law requires. Can you explain why?
Congressman, we are upholding the ONC Act, and we are upholding the resource management plan that implements that. The ASQ for fiscal year 24 is 132 million board feet.
Yes, I'll just say that the facts that I have here indicate otherwise, but I'm out of time. But if you'll provide me with the information that indicates you have been abiding by the requirements of that law, I would appreciate it. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I find it really unbelievable that those are the rules and regs under this administration. And what I would hope, and at this point, that the loggers that logged they didn't hit any tree spikes or nails intentionally placed in there. So those rules and regs are unbelievable for this administration. At Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, the Park Service is changing policies relating to conditional use authorizations, or CUAs, which are required for local businesses that provide services that increase access to the park. Under the new policies, local operators can no longer stack CUA applications for similar activities. They must now pay additional fees and submit individual applications for each activity or service they would like to provide for the local community and visitors to the park. These are costing local businesses thousands of dollars in additional fees just to process an application. Some of these operators have shared they'll likely have to close up shop because this additional red tape is making it no longer cost effective to operate their business. To their credit, the leadership at Voyageurs National Park has worked closely with the operators to find a solution. But it is national policies set by the Park Service headquarters here in Washington that are forcing them to make these changes. Director Sams, without partnerships, operators, would the Park Service be able to provide the same recreational opportunities that they do today?
Thank you, Congressman. Voyageurs National Park has held discussions, as you said, and workshops with the public for the past year regarding the plan to manage frozen lake access, of course. This summer, the park will embark on the
Director
environmental
Sams,
system.
Director Sams, excuse me, I've only got a couple minutes left. With these partnerships, would the Park Service be able to provide the same recreational opportunities that they do today?
We will continue to work to do our best to ensure that we offer those same activities.
Without the operators?
No, sir. In partnership with the operators.
What actions is the service taking to ensure these small and local businesses are able to reasonably operate and provide access for the American people? That's the mission statement, right? For the American people to be able to enjoy the parks.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What actions are you taking?
You know, as we're modernizing these concessionaire practices and talking about transparency, and we will work towards transparency in every way so that we can demonstrate that we're getting a fair deal for the American people. We want to ensure that the multiple uses of recreation that happen in Voyageurs, which is a fantastic park, will continue in the future. And I'm very proud of the team that is working to ensure that we're providing additional support on what that will look like and how to apply.
And that's why I said the park, in my statement, the Park Service Director is doing a good job trying to work, but he's following your policies on the CUAs. So I'd ask you to look into that, because I think if we lose those operators, we're going to lose access to the park from the people if operators go out of business. So will you commit to reviewing the national policies that are running counter to the service's mission to provide opportunities for public use and enjoyment of our parks?
I'll take this concern directly back to my staff and look at our CEUs and see what we're doing.
Thank you. I hope these policies are seriously addressed by you. Appreciate it. Director Stone-Manning, in the BLM's recent waste prevention rule, the Bureau admits that venting and flaring usually occurs due to pipeline capacity constraints. What steps is the Bureau taking to expedite rights-of-way approval for oil and gas infrastructure that prevent flaring, such as gathering lines?
Congressman, thank you for the question. You know, our folks on the ground work hard every day.
What steps are you taking to expedite right-of-way approval for oil and gas infrastructure that prevent flaring, such as gathering lines?
When gathering lines come before us, we jump right to it and go through the process.
How many gathering lines applications are in your office right now, do you think?
Congressman, I don't have that in front of me.
You know what a gathering line is?
Yes.
Explain it.
An oil and gas Are you playing Stump the Director, Congressman? An oil and gas gathering line, as the name implies, enables the facility to get their product to the larger pipelines that are going to get it on to the Gulf or wherever it's going.
The gathering lines are part of a categorical exclusion, right? CADEX?
We do have CADEXs for gathering lines. And if I recall correctly, this is old. This is from probably 6 or 8 months ago. I think we've only used it one time because we've only had one ask.
One ask? Are you just saying you have one request for a gathering line in your office today?
No, Congressman, as I mentioned, that's from about 6 or 8 months ago, but I recall that being the number.
Would you please get back to our office on the number of gathering lines that are waiting?
I would.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I'd like to enter into the record here, asking unanimous consent to enter into the record the BLM budget proposal for public domain forest management. The budget makes no mention of the wildfire risk 5-year monitoring, maintenance, and treatment plan for the second year in a row, and actually proposed a decrease in the planned acres to treat from fiscal year 2023. BLM budget also has a proposed decreases of $500,000, resulting in 50,000 less seedlings being planted for restoration efforts.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add something to the record, if I may. I ask unanimous consent to enter the record this article from the Wall Street Journal.
Let me dispense with this one. Without objection, so entered into the record and in the BLM budget proposal. Representative Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Real quick, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this article from the Wall Street Journal entitled "Why the World Has Gone Cuckoo for Copper," dated May 14th of 2024.
Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Ms. Hoyle from the great state of Oregon.
Thank you very much.
Director Stone-Manning, hello. I know we've spoken many times before. Today, I specifically would like to discuss with you the Western Oregon Operating Plan, which is an agreement between the Bureau of Land Management, the Oregon Department of Forestry, Douglas Forest Protective Association, Coos Forest Protective Association, tribal tribes, and we have in Oregon a very unique checkerboard map where private, tribal, federal, and state lands are all on a checkerboard. So it makes it difficult to fight fires unless we're all cooperating together. The entire Oregon delegation, Democrats and Republicans, have made it very clear and signed letters to say that we want the WOOP to remain in place. So I would like to ask for your commitment to make sure that that happens. And secondarily, it is my understanding that it is on the table from the BLM to remove Coos Bay and Roseburg from the WOOP because they are wet forests. Let me tell you, we had the Agnes fire that was down in Curry County coming up into Coos County that burned from July through the fall. We've also had fires in Roseburg. Where there's a large population. The bottom line is that with climate change, with drier conditions, we are seeing fires that are different and that are coming into the wildland-urban interface and putting our populations in danger. We know that it costs more to fight fires in Oregon than it does in other places, and also that over almost 99% of the forest land that the BLM manages is in the ONC lands, is in Oregon. So I would like your commitment on keeping the WOOP in place, and also a commitment to do more research before you even think of moving forward in taking Coos Bay and Roseburg out from the WOOP. Thank you. Congressman, thank you for the question. Of course, protecting our communities and our landscapes is a huge priority for the BLM. I was pleased to meet with you about WOOP. I've been working with Director Barry Bashu on this topic. He is in negotiations practically as we speak with ODF and the Fire Protective Association. I'm confident that we will reach agreement by the time that the WOOP is up in June. And I couldn't agree more. Fires are becoming harder and longer and more intense on the landscape, which is in part why it's so important that we get a handle on the climate crisis, which is why you see the budget before you that you do.
Thank you. Just to follow up, I know that negotiations are happening. I know that there are financial considerations. I can tell you that what I have seen in the time that I've been in Oregon is that we shortchange the money up front in preventing wildfires from happening and debris removal. And then we will write an unlimited check when we're losing millions of acres to these extreme wildfires. And what, again, I want to impress upon you is just because you're looking at the South Coast as a wet forest, the fact of the matter is people's lives, people's homes, and our beautiful forests are in danger. And again, it's a very complex area, and what we have seen since the fires in 2020 is great cooperation between the feds and the state and our private wildland firefighters, our professional firefighters, our tribal fire management and firefighters. We'd like to see that continue, but again, I do not think, and I seriously, seriously hope that the thought of pulling Coos Bay and Roseburg from the WOOP is not something we're considering, and that is off the table, and I really would like your commitment on that.
Congressman, thank you for the question. My commitment is we will actively fight fire and do our job to fight fire all throughout your district. And the agreement of who pays for it and how and when and where is what's on the table. What is not on the table is doing our part to ensure that we keep people and places safe.
So again, to follow up, and I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but
I want to be abundantly clear. Representative Benson and I share Roseburg as a district. The district splits at Roseburg and the South Coast and Coos Bay. It is vitally important that that stay in the WOOP, and if that isn't going to happen, I want to make sure that you alert our office before any decisions are made.
Congresswoman, you have my commitment that you will know before any decisions are made.
Does the gentle lady yield?
I yield.
The gentle lady yields. Now, I'd like to recognize Representative Moylan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing, of course, and giving us the opportunity to speak with Director Stone-Manning and Director Sams. Thank you to the panel for being here and regarding the upcoming budget of the National Park Service and how they plan to effectively utilize it. So my district of Guam is home to 50 parks, including the War and the Pacific National Historic Park in Assen, which commemorates the bravery and sacrifice of those serving in the Pacific Theater of World War II. It is important that Guam and the National Park Service work together to protect these sites so that future generations can appreciate them as we do now. Additionally, nearly 1/3 of my island is owned by the federal government. However, our local parks officers are stretched thin. They face serious personnel shortages, which impacts their ability to take care of these lands. So it's critical that the Department of Interior do everything that they can to conserve and protect our island's natural beauty. Dr. Stone-Manning, regarding the 30 by 30 program, does the administration consult with local and indigenous groups on if and how lands should be preserved?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Sort of at the heart of the President's America the Beautiful initiative is locally led collaborative conservation.
Well, thank you, Director Stone-Manning. Unfortunately, the administration has shown that it does not care about the local and indigenous groups' experience on what is best for their lands. Rather, the administration oversteps and acts without regards to local stakeholders. I would like to bring to the committee's attention the Pacific Remote Island Marianas National Monument, specifically the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument. This status was granted despite strong local opposition from my constituents and the democratically elected government of Guam. It's very unfortunate our voice wasn't heard. Dr. Sams, in 2019, the National Park Service began consideration for designating Maningan Concentration Camp as a National Historic Landmark. As the public comment period remains ongoing, could you speak on the ongoing National Landmarks Committee meeting and provide an update on the general comment period?
Thank you for the question. I don't have that right before me, but I'm happy to get that back to you in writing about our most recent meeting on that issue and provide you all your information.
I appreciate that, especially now we have a special Liberation Day coming up, our 80th anniversary of the Liberation Day of Guam, and that will be important information I'd like to have. Thank you.
Yes, sir, I'm looking forward, I'm hoping to get out there. My grandfather fought in World War II aboard a destroyer, USS Converse, and had talked about the invasion of Guam.
Appreciate it. Dr. Sams, in January of 2023, the President signed into law the Guam National Heritage Area Feasibility Study. My office has yet to receive any updates on the status of this study. So when does the MPS anticipate the completion of this study, and how can we expedite this?
I don't know thank you for the question. I don't know the exact date, but I'll get you the exact date too, also in writing, and give you an update. Happy to work with you and your staff on that.
We'll work closely, and I appreciate that. Thank you. And finally, Director Sams, the National Park Service has designated the War and the Pacific National Historic Park 5th, in line with the supplemental funding request. 5th. This is a serious underfunded and understaffed federal park suffering from flood damage. Monuments are falling apart, and infrastructure which is in the last leg. Director Sams, could you speak to what must happen for the National Historic Park to be considered higher priority by your agency?
You know, as I understand, we have like $2.6 million to preserve the World War II structures at the War and the Pacific National Historic Park proposed in fiscal year's 2025's budget. And we understand that we also have more than $240,000 in maintenance action team projects that will go towards that. It's proposed in our 2025 budget.
But we're still fifth in line with the supplemental funding request. Are you saying that is no longer there, that you have funded it, or are we fifth in line still for supplemental funding?
I'm going to defer to my comptroller and where we're at with that. Ms. Jessica Bowen.
The administration submitted a disaster supplemental request in the fall for disasters that occurred in 2023. No disaster supplemental appropriation was received with the FY24 appropriation, and so we are currently evaluating how to best recover from disasters across the country within available funding.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the gentle lady from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here today. Director Stone-Manning, we've heard a lot about oil and gas companies over the last few weeks, and not all of it's been good. Just last week, a report came out finding that Donald Trump asked Big Oil for $1 billion for his campaign, and in return, he would roll back environmental regulations. Earlier this month, we found out from the FTC that Pioneer Resources, which is currently merging with Exxon, colluded with OPEC to pad their pockets and keep prices high for American families. Market manipulation. At the same time, Republicans here in Congress are somehow calling it Biden's war on American energy, while at the same time, Big Oil continues to break records for both production and profit. It's not adding up to me, but of course it's not. And these conversations we continue to have around that are really exhausting. Once again, Republicans on this committee are trying to blame things like environmental regulations and the new BLM oil and gas rule, which finally provides a better return for the American taxpayer. I say they are continuing to gaslight the American people. These complaints line up directly with the talking points of big oil lobbyists who decried the rule while making record profits and showering their shareholders in billions through dividends and stock buybacks. In fact, one oil executive actually came here and said he didn't even like to read. He didn't want to read rules. It was just too much, which I find very hard to understand. One of their biggest gripes is about the new bonding provisions, calling them expensive and onerous. But these regulations will actually provide taxpayers and communities from having to clean up after the oil and gas industry. But before this final rule, these rates hadn't been updated in over a half century. Between 1951 and now, companies could pay as little as $25,000 to cover all of their oil wells in a state. Between 1960 and now, companies could pay as little as $10,000 to cover all their wells on a lease. These rates haven't been updated to account for inflation, nor have they tracked technological advancements, including well depth, which substantially increases mitigation costs. So to do a little comparison, Director Stone-Manning, wind and solar projects on public lands must also be bonded to ensure that the public lands they are sited on are reclaimed after a project. Is this correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it is my understanding that BLM set minimum bond rates for wind and solar in 2016, and that the regulations dictate that those minimums be adjusted for inflation periodically. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So just for the record, these regulations require wind and solar developers to pay as much as $20,000 per wind turbine or $20,000 per acre of solar panels or $10,000 per acre for solar in priority areas. Considering some proposed wind projects consist of several hundred turbines and some solar projects are thousands of acres in size, it's not a stretch to say that these bonds can often be quite more expensive than bonds covering oil and gas wells. Last question for you. Do you know of any utility-scale wind or solar projects on federal public land or even on just BLM land that are orphaned or abandoned?
I do not, Congresswoman.
Right, neither do I. And yet we have oil and gas wells that have been orphaned and abandoned.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I just think it's worth noting that I've never heard of a pollution disaster caused by end-of-life solar or wind projects, unlike the environmental and public health crises my constituents deal with every day due to oil and gas wells. We have heard so many complaints from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and from industry about the new $150,000 minimum bond for oil and gas leases, or the new $500,000 minimum for a bond covering of all wells statewide. But if wind and solar companies can afford to ensure their sites are mitigated and reclaimed, then the multi-billion-dollar oil and gas companies certainly can do that as well. Do you agree?
I do agree, and Congresswoman, and of course, what it's going to do is protect the American taxpayer so that they're not left holding the bag in the future.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Lady yields, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Montana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am sorry that I can't see you behind that large stack of regulations that you've presented there. I appreciate you holding this crucial budget hearing today. The BLM plays a vital role in management and facilitation of our land out west, especially in Montana, where BLM land comprises nearly 1/3 of our state. However, under the current radical administration, we witness a harmful trend where BLM's land management decisions are working against the very communities and residents the agencies is meant to serve. Whether it's the lack of leasing opportunities, the war being waged against the coal industry, or the ongoing efforts to restrict access to Montana's productive lands, it's clear to me that despite being from our great state, Director Stone-Manning and her agency's priorities are at complete odds with what is in the best interest of Montana. I'm eager to hear from both her and Director Sams about why they believe they deserve a $120 million increase in total funding. Ranking Member Neguse, I am sorry that you were not here to hear the filibuster from Ms. Porter and Mr. Levin about revenue and the income that these lands are supposed to produce. Because what they failed to reference is the fact that capacity and rental fees have been reduced for renewables, renewable energy, capacity and rental fees by 80%. By 80%. And that's after they've already been heavily, heavily subsidized by the taxpayers across this nation. Director Sams, speaking of reducing fees, why did the National Park Service relinquish control of RFK Complex instead of leveraging it for our park system's benefit when it was rented to DC for just $1? You want to have conversations about fees? It was rented for $1 to capitalize on the revenue potential instead of the money going to help make a dent in the $22 billion deferred maintenance backlog. That could have easily been a valuable revenue source to support the projects that you're requesting.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. When we looked at this and spoke with the District of Columbia and keeping it within the federal family, we recognize that the district has an opportunity to be able to really take over jurisdiction and shifting administrative responsibility to the district so that they can actually see some better use of it.
And are they going to be collecting revenue for the development of this 160-acre site?
That'd be a question best asked to them than to me, sir.
Excuse me?
That'd be a question best asked to the district than to me, sir.
So, sir, you're leasing them the ground for $1. They're going to generate a development of 160 acres of some of the most prime real estate in the country, and you don't think that they're going to generate revenue, or didn't think to ask, are they going to generate revenue, and possibly that some of that revenue should be going back to the taxpayers so that we could utilize it for our park system?
Sir, it is Congress who will be leasing that to them in the direction of
Based
Congress.
upon the recommendation of the National Park Service. So we don't know about the revenue that the District of Columbia is going to generate from 160 acres, but we are very concerned about someone who's developing the resources to help heat our homes and power our vehicles to push freight across this country. And yet, on the other hand, we're going to reduce the leases and the revenue that's generated by renewables for the capacity and rental fees by 80%. But the District of Columbia is going to make sure that they collect and retain all of the revenue. Director Stone-Manning, I hear you talk about the transition to a clean energy economy. And while that may be this administration's goal, it is not the law, especially when it comes to land use. And we continue to hear about the manipulation of policy by rule change, not by law change. And that is very problematic for most of the people that are sitting in here. And quite frankly, it should be disturbing for anybody, Republican or Democrat. We can't have rule changes overriding what the law and the intent of the law was. In your budget testimony, you emphasize the importance of this funding for your clean energy projects. I'm curious to hear how covering a currently productive swath of land with acres of glass for such an unreliable, intermittent use of energy that meets your definition of conservation, especially when compared to the generation of work and management by ranchers and farmers on that land.
Congressman, first of all, it's nice to see somebody from Montana. I know we don't always agree, but Montana pride rises above that, I hope. I think I heard your question to ask.
How would you explain that covering over hundreds of acres of land with solar panels meets your definition of conservation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's why we're working on the Western Solar Plan as we speak, so that we make sure that because it is still development, it's carbon pollution free, but it's still development, that we drive that development to the most appropriate places on the landscape as possible, just like we drive all of our development to the most appropriate landscape.
Okay, so Montana coal producers allocate a significant portion of their revenue annually to reclamation projects. And I've been out on those projects, and they are actually quantifiably and measurably more productive after they have extracted their resources and then do the reclamation efforts. Visiting any of these sites would reveal no trace of past mining activity. Why is this practice, which involves productive use followed by restoration to its original state, more productive, again, not considered land conservation?
Congressman, the concern, of course, with that work is the coal that is burned, right? It's not about the landscape that is reclaimed after the coal is dug up. The concern is about driving our economy towards a clean energy economy.
And again, we continue to hear about going to a clean energy economy, but again, we're superseding the law and the intent of the law and the Taylor Grazing Act and the use of those lands by abusing the rulemaking process. Mr. Chair, thank you so much for my time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neguse, for his questions.
Thank you, Director Stone-Manning and Director Sams, for your testimony and for indulging the committee here, and know that it's been a robust hearing thus far, and suspect that will continue. I really wanted to ask Dr. Sams you a series of questions. Before I do so, I'll just take one moment to again thank Director Stone-Manning, your agency, for the steps that you took to protect the Thompson Divide. And of course, as you know, we are very much engaged in an effort here in the Congress to make those protections permanent through the CORE Act, which myself and Senator Bennett and Senator Hickenlooper have introduced, and it has variations, iterative versions of it have passed the House multiple times in the last several years. Our hope springs eternal that we'll be able to get that across the finish line. But in the interim, the protections afforded to the Thompson Divide by virtue of your agency's decision are incredibly important to the folks in Colorado, and just want to express my gratitude to the agency for taking that steps. To the extent you would like to expound on that, I'm happy to give you an opportunity. But
Thank you, Congressman. I just wanted to say that the thanks there goes to the leadership of Secretary Holland.
Director Sams, I want to also say thank you for the work that you do and the National Park Service does every day. Of course, as you know, Rocky Mountain National Park is in my district, considered a crown jewel of the NPS system, and grateful for the partnership that we have with folks there. I want to talk a bit about wildland firefighting, and as you know, we've raised this issue at prior hearings with respect to the challenges that our wildland firefighters are facing in terms of government housing rates. And we sent a letter, myself, a number of my colleagues, on a bipartisan basis to both you and Chief Moore earlier this year. I received your response, or a response that was sent on behalf of your agency last month. What I am hoping you can kind of help me understand, I recognize that the NPS has certain constraints that you all are operating under, particularly as it relates to OMB's circular guidance. But clearly, that guidance, as it is being implemented and interpreted today, is having disastrous impacts for federal wildland firefighters who are facing exorbitant rent increases. And I am wondering what conversations you've had with your colleagues at OMB about necessary changes that should be made to the circular that would still comport with federal law, but would enable your agency to address what is clearly an emerging crisis.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I started out my career as a wildlands firefighter. My son is currently a wildlands firefighter for Oregon Department of Forestry. And so housing, of course, is a critical issue for any of our firefighters. And recognizing that we knew that there were going to be rent increases this year, I've asked for those to be extended out over a couple years and have received permission to do so, and we're implementing that. But that being said, we're working very closely in trying to figure out exactly where the increases are happening in the different markets, how can we balance those out, what other authorities both the Secretary and I have to be able to try to mitigate for those increases and develop more public-private partnerships to expand our housing, and so that we can make it more affordable for our firefighters and our frontline NPS staff.
Well, I would say I appreciate that, Director Sams, and I would hope with respect to the decision that you just described with respect to extending the rent increases over a period of years, that you could provide our office with further clarity on that, because I was unaware of that, and that would be something very important for us to be able to communicate back, us meaning collectively the members who sent that letter, to the constituents that we've heard from and the federal wildland firefighters that we've heard from. I would also just say, while I am supportive of NPS and DOI's efforts to increase their housing stock, as reflected in the budget submission that you all have sent over this year, just in full candor, I'm going to personally apply a much more discerning eye towards supporting any investments in increasing the housing stock, absent some direct communication from OMB, from NPS, from DOI, from the relevant authorities, that you all would like to see some deviation, some new statutory authority or change in the underlying organic statutes that would give you the ability to address this problem. Because you can imagine, I mean, if we just simply allocate more dollars for you all to secure more housing, and you all then, by virtue of the 4-year periodic comparable rent analysis that you do with this new housing, come back to us and to the federal wildland firefighters and say that the rent increase is going to be sustained in out years because that's the way the market is functioning, we haven't really addressed that fundamental problem. So I would implore you to let us know what we can do on the statutory side. I happen to think, having reviewed the OMB circular, that the administration can take a variety of different steps that would give you some flexibility, which it sounds like they may have already done, because in the letter that we got from the NPS, and I appreciate very much the chairman's indulgence, it said here, I'll just quote from you, from this letter, the NPS does not set its own rents, nor does it have the authority to disregard rental implementation requirements, to pause, or to reverse rental changes. And this is from, I forget the name of the gentleman that, within your agency, one of the assistant, well, I don't know, I'll get the right title here, but in any event, so that's very different from what you just described. And so that my point here is, I do think there's room in the OMB circular. And if it requires us advocating for the same, we're happy to do that. So again, I thank the chairman for.
Gentleman yields. I'll recognize the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. I'd like to start with my comments directed to Director Sams, but they also apply to the BLM as well. And I know this will shock you. I want to give you a compliment, both of you, and just say that over and over again, I hear positive feedback about members that work for both BLM and National Park Service on the ground in Utah. And we certainly have our differences with both your agencies, particularly as it relates to the Washington, D.C. side. But I'm constantly told how helpful the people are on the ground. And I want to bring up a specific case, Director Sams. I have in my hand a letter, and I'd like to ask that it be submitted for the record, from Catherine Hammond, Regional Director of Glen Canyon National Parks, talking about working with a group of people, our houseboat owners on Lake Powell. And I know that they have had a number of internal meetings and external meetings with these houseboat owners to build a good relationship. And I just want to tell you they're doing a good job, and that how helpful that is to me when they work to build these good relationships, and how much that is appreciated back in the district. Likewise, and that's, thank you, that's Superintendent Kearns. Superintendent Pace has been recently selected to lead the Canyonlands and Arches National Park area. And as you know, in my district, there's few districts like mine in the entire country with 2 national parks and the beautiful areas that we have. It's part of Bears Ears and other areas. She, when she was first appointed, she came to my office and met me. We established a great relationship, and just wanted to give her a shout out as well and appreciate that relationship. She has a very hard task because our national parks in Utah are being what we call loved to death. And there's a tremendous pressure to put a reservation system in, and they've experimented with several reservation systems. And we'd just like to ask you to be personally involved in that, because if we get it right, there's a lot of good. And if we get it wrong, it can really be a detriment to the economy of the area. And just making sure that we work with our local stakeholders to make sure we get it right is very important. So appreciate that and wanted to bring that up. Director Stone-Manning, part of my district is Bears Ears, and we constantly, of course, as you know, have a very difficult issue between going back and forth between administrations on the actual use of this land. But the theme that does not change as we go back and forth between administrations is lack of resources. This is, at the very least, is probably 1.3 million acres. And we just don't have the people on the ground to manage 1.3 million acres and the people that are coming to see the antiquities and things like that. So would like to continue to emphasize the fact that we need more resources in the area to manage this land. Regardless of where we end up on the designation, it just needs more resources, and would love to have your help with that.
Congressman, thank you. And given this is a budget hearing, we would welcome the help. Don't let me stop you.
Well, it's priorities, right? Yeah. It's priorities. And it feels like to those of us in that area that this has not been a priority. This is 1.3 million acres, and I think the number, if I'm not mistaken, is 2, maybe 4 law enforcement BLM agents to manage 1.3 million acres. You can see the impossibility of that problem for them. And Director, you won't be surprised that the BLM conservation rule is hugely problematic in my district. I hardly have an opportunity to speak here where I don't bring up the fact that 90% of these counties is federal land, 90%. And the fact that there can be arbitrary decisions thousands of miles away that impact grazing and recreation and other uses on the land without appropriate input. You know, there was not a single hearing in Utah on this rule, not a single one. The people of Utah had no opportunity to express in person their concerns. And I just want to speak for them today to say they're very frustrated, they're very concerned with this ruling. And as you know, I'm sponsoring the West Act to repeal that. And would love to have conversations with your organization about the end goal. You know, we actually share the same end goal. We all want to preserve and protect and make sure this land is there for our grandchildren. But how we get there and who gets to make those decisions is incredibly frustrating to my district. And I've used all my time, so you don't get a chance to respond, but I think I've made my point. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize Ms. Ledger-Hernandez for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Director Stone-Manning and Director Sams and Comptroller Brown for being here today. Thank you very much, actually, for the hard work that you've put in that I think this paper recognizes, right? I want to see this as the thousands of public comments that you have received, the careful study of how do we protect our public lands and our public resources, because we must remember those are American resources. They belong to us. And in order to figure out how to best go along protecting them, ensuring that we receive the royalties that are due us, that we protect it for those future generations, that we honor the creation that they reflect for those who hold those places sacred, whether from a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective, or an indigenous perspective. It takes time, and I know you've done that. So I want to start by thanking you for that work. In particular, with regards to the onshore oil and gas leasing rule, royalties make up a really important part of my state's budget. As you know, we have a lot of public lands, we have a lot of federal lands, and we benefit from those oil and gas royalties. Can you describe how drafting the final onshore oil and gas leasing rule, how did you make sure you coordinated with the public, that is, the people who actually own these natural resources, as well as the oil and gas companies who are making record profits right at this time? So you can tell us, can you share a little bit about the coordination, the input you received from both sides?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for the question. And of course, so much in the oil and gas rule that you see before you is implementing what Congress asked us to do through the Inflation Reduction Act, what with the increases of royalty rates. But we held many public meetings, both in person and virtually. We got over 200,000 comments on the rule that we pored over, and the final product is a result of what we heard both from Congress and what we heard from the public.
Thank you very much. And as you can see, 200,000 comments takes up a lot of space. I want to really make sure that we get to an issue that was sort of big picture. I want to get to a little hyper-local issue that I think affects other places as well. The Valles Caldera National Park and the Santa Fe National Forest. As you know, Director Sams, there's been a significant number of cattle that are routinely found in the park. I get a lot of texts and comments about that. In fact, you're going to be hiring wranglers for the next 6 months every day to gather the cattle up. As you know, in the state of New Mexico, we are a fence-out state, meaning landowners are responsible for fencing out livestock if they don't want them on their property. Well, I know you're not subject to those federal laws. It is a tradition, and it is important to make sure that we do the maintenance ahead so you do not have to have 6 months of wranglers in the park, and so that we can preserve the resources of the park. So can you tell me can you actually commit to maintain the portions of the Valles Caldera fence within the Park Service's jurisdiction? And let me know what steps you're going to be taking to address challengers or barriers to ensure the proper upkeep of this very important asset.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. You know, I come from a ranching family. I understand the importance of being accountable for your own cattle and or horses. We ran over 300 head of cattle and 100 head of horses. That being said, and recognizing the issues that we face at Valles Caldera, we're working very closely with the U.S. Forest Service on a management plan for that. We're looking at how exactly we can continue to build the fence out, and then the responsibilities each of us will have on maintaining that fence. I'm happy to get that information and more specifics on that back to you directly in writing.
Well, thank you. And I think this need to coordinate with all kinds of different agencies and jurisdictions, including the ranchers, including the Forest Service, making sure that what we're looking at is bringing back, both on Forest Service land, the health of the grazing lands, and then keeping those fences up. Good fences make good neighbors. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields, and I just mentioned that those are not comments.
But they reflect the comments.
Those are the new rules that have been proposed by the Bureau of Land Management during the Biden administration.
Well, thank you. I just was pointing out that I'm sure that they reflect the comments that they've received, the 200,000 on just one rule. So thank you very much for the clarification, Mr. Chair.
Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Stone-Manning, during a May 1st hearing before the full committee, Secretary Howland testified that since President Biden has been in office since January 2021, we have approved mining or mining modification permits since the president has been in office. That includes 5 critical mines. Of these 5 mines that have been permitted under this administration, how many are critical minerals?
Congressman, thanks for the question. Again, it's roughly 40 mines, 5 of which are critical minerals, a couple lithium, barium, zinc.
How many of them were permitted from start to finish under this administration?
Congressman, I would have to get back to you on that question. I know the vanadium mine was start to finish, but I'd have to get back to you on that question.
How many received EISs under the previous administration?
Again, I would have to get back to you. I know that the lithium mine, Thacker Pass, the EIS was under the previous administration. We did the notice to proceed.
How many mine or mine modification permits has Interior denied under this administration?
Congressman, I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect, I don't know of one that we've
Do you know how many are awaiting an EIS?
Yes. I just asked for
Right.
that. I just asked for that number, and I think it's 90, but I'll get back to you.
How many are awaiting a record of decision?
Well, the record of decision comes after the EIS.
So that's still 90?
Mhm.
Okay. Do me a favor, you said you're going to get back in touch with us. Can you make sure that by the end of the month, the end of this month, May?
I'm happy to get you that information.
All right, thank you. Also, Amos Hoshin, the Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security, said that we don't have a lot of new supply of copper coming online around the world. And what concerns me is even when a discovery is made, it could take between 7 and 15 years before the first copper comes out. Now, that was his quote. Do you share those concerns regarding copper supply?
Congressman, I don't know about the global market supply of copper. I do know that when a proposal comes before us, we dig in. We spend on average 5 years on a hard rock mine EIS.
What, if anything, are y'all doing to expedite your reviews to ensure that we don't run out of this supply, since the deposits that are active right now, they're being depleted?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear that.
What are you doing to expedite the reviews?
So as I think you know, we worked with the interagency working group on critical minerals to identify how we can get more efficient in our work. Congress, of course, I think can play a role in that, but we are diving into the report and working hard to turn those around. And again, an EIS on average for a hard rock mine is somewhere between 4 and 5 years.
All right, thank you. I tell you what, I'm going to yield back to the fellow hiding behind a large stack of rules. I think it's our chairman back there.
If I might add one thing, we of course are going to follow the Fiscal Reform Act that now tells us to get those EISs done in 2.
Gentleman yields. Director Stone-Manning, so I'm assuming when you do the so-called renewable projects, you do a NEPA analysis, is that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
As part of that NEPA analysis, do you do the people that conduct it Do they evaluate how many endangered species are going to be killed as a result of those so-called renewable projects?
Congressman, we work closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service when Section 7 is implicated.
Yeah, isn't it accurate that we see a lot of deaths, eagles, other endangered species, as a result of especially the wind turbines and actually the solar panels also? Because wasn't there, was it the Ivanpah project out in California? I might not have said it right. It's over a decade old, that they referred to the birds as flamers when they went through the solar array because they were torched. Will there be a full analysis of the number of endangered species that are going to be killed as a result of building these projects?
Congressman, we work every day with the Fish and Wildlife Service as we do our permitting work to ensure that we are complying with the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, does that concern you that we see the number of deaths of endangered species with these so-called renewable projects?
Congressman, the biodiversity crisis facing our planet concerns me every day.
I'd like to now recognize the gentle lady from Wyoming. I'm sorry, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know it's difficult. You can't see us back from up there, but thanks for the opportunity to join on the committee today for this important hearing. I also want to welcome our panelists this morning. Thank you both for being here. Director Sams, it's good to see you again. And I got to say, it's good to have a fellow Pacific Northwesterner in a position of national responsibility. So good to see you. I want to focus the committee's attention on something that's of huge concern that's happening in my district. The National Park Service, in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Service, recently decided, and I might add, against the will of the majority of my constituents, that they will be introducing grizzly bears into my district. You heard me correctly. Grizzly bears. The federal government has finalized a plan to airdrop these bears into the North Cascades ecosystem. So, Director Sams, quickly, could you tell us how does airdropping apex predators into the NCE fit with the National Park Service's mission of preserving the natural and cultural resources of the national park system?
Thank you, Congressman. It's nice to see you again. I appreciate our work in the past, and I look forward to continuing our work in the future. The National Park Service is directly responsible for implementing the Organic Act, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, is responsible for implementing the Endangered Species Act. These laws require the agencies to recover, protect, and preserve threatened and endangered species as a public trust to ensure future generations benefit from the same wildlife resources that we enjoy today. Restoring a population of the North Cascades would help advance the recovery of the species currently listed as threatened in the lower 48.
So I might point out that grizzly bears, as you know, have not existed in this ecosystem for decades. So the NPS truly is not preserving a grizzly park, nor does it support the NPS's goal. And I found this on your website in the About Us section, your goal of creating close-to-home opportunities for kids and families to get outside, be active, and have fun. I just got to say that it's a little too close to home for my constituents and certainly is not going to be fun. In reviewing the President's proposed NPS budget for fiscal year 25, I noticed that it proposes $194,000 for one FTE to function as a cultural liaison for Indigenous communities at the North Cascades National Park, Lake Chelan, and Ross Lake National Recreation Area. Now, I assume that this includes danger pay, as you also stated in your testimony, the most valuable resource the NPS has are its employees. However, I did not see a justification to support the translocation of grizzly bears from their existing ecosystem into the district, nor did I see any educational campaign or public outreach to inform my constituents, that people that live up there, and visitors who come to the area, that they must be aware of grizzly bears. Could you tell us how much your agency is allocating to activities surrounding the establishment of the bears in the NCE, including the protection of your employees and the inhabitants?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. As you know, we had this discussion. My people have lived with grizzly bears for 10,000 years, and their demise has only been in less than the last 70 years, really, in that effort. And looking at it, we know that we've been able to manage them as a species in the National Park Service, whether that be at Yellowstone or Grand Tetons. Matter of fact, my own family experienced them one night when a ranger came by to tell us a mama bear, grizzly, and her cubs were coming through. And we woke up and made sure that we were protected. And then as soon as they made their way through, we went back and went to sleep with no problem out in the woods. To your specific question, I'm going to defer to my colleague here to talk a little bit more about the funding process, but I can tell you we are committed to providing education in the community, and we're working very closely with Washington's Fish and Wildlife staff too.
I think in addition to the specific funding that is proposed as a programmatic increase for North Cascades, there's also more than $100 million proposed to restore the capacity that's lost in FY24 across every park and every program so that the parks aren't absorbing that lost purchasing power, and they have additional funding to serve visitors and protect resources.
When your agency coordinated with the Fish and Wildlife Service to follow through with this, what I saw as a predetermined plan to bring the bears into the area, was the safety of your Park Service agents and the people who surround this ecosystem of consideration? Was there safety, or was their safety ignored, just like my constituents' belief is that their concerns were because the federal government knows best? I also want to ask, did the NPS consult with other federal agencies besides Fish and Wildlife Service?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll have to go back about all the other agencies we may have spoken with along with Fish and Wildlife. But yes, we have a very robust training program about safety and working in and around apex predators, whether that be grizzly bears, wolves, or any mountain lions and the such. And we will ensure that also we provide that also to the general public when they actually intermingle or may have a chance in backcountry of coming across such apex predators.
Let me let you know that I asked the Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection if he was aware of this new threat, because they have agents up in that area, CBP agents operating the northern border, and surprisingly, he was not aware. I just got to say that the example of this in my district, it's certainly not the first or probably won't be the last time the federal government, in my view, oversteps its bounds, particularly when it comes to endangered and threatened species. The people's concerns up there are valid. I think they need to be listened to. And I think with all the discussion that we've had this morning about other issues facing the Park Service, I believe that this money could be going to real issues that the service is facing, such as the wildfires, which you brought up, the housing issues, the shortages, the road repairs. But instead, it's going to be going to this purpose that I think is going to just going to appease a lot of outside environmental organizations. It's my job to ensure that the voice of the people of Central Washington are heard, and that I want to let you know that the majority of the people in this area staunchly oppose apex predators being airdropped, literally airdropped into their backyards using their own tax dollars. So I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on this issue that's not going away, and we've got to solve. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for going over time.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, ma'am, for being here and for your testimony. I really appreciate you, and thank you all. I also want to thank you for your support, actually, on the approval of the Copperhead and Loving pipeline project. This pipeline is an essential project to our country's domestic supply of oil and gas. It will further our energy independence and security, while bringing good-paying jobs to an economically deprived area. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for supporting my bill, H.R. 7377, the Royalty Resiliency Act. This common sense fix will allow operators to pay the correct amount of royalties upfront, saving taxpaying dollars in the long run and alleviating the present honor accounting nightmare. So thank you for working with my office for that. Moving on to the President's fiscal year 25 budget request, ma'am. President Biden's budget request includes funding for an additional 104 full-time employees to your agency. How many of these new full-time employees will work in the Carlsbad, New Mexico BLM field office? Do you know, ma'am?
Congressman, I don't. I do know that we are trying to tackle the vacancy issue in the Carlsbad office. We've got 115 FTEs working there now and a table of organization that allows for 170, and we're working hard on that. But also, I'm so proud of them for reaching record highs on the number of permits to drill that they're getting out the door, despite those staffing shortages.
Okay. The Carlsbad office is the most active BLM office in the entire country, as you just articulated. And in 2023 alone, the office received 2,500 APDs. And unfortunately, the office is only 2/3 staff. So while you commend the workers that are putting out record output, we still have quite a long ways to go, and I think we can accomplish that. And earlier this year, I wrote to Ms. Melanie Barnes, then staff director of BLM in New Mexico staff office, to inquire about this shortfall. And according to the response that I received, the Carlsbad office still has a shortfall of 55 employees, several who are critical to the APD process and approval of these agreements. And so we need to make sure that we do continue to move forward and just get better and work harder, because they are drastically behind. And can you please commit to me today that in good faith that you will continue to communicate with my office on your efforts to be proactive as possible to make sure we get these numbers back up and get a fully staffed office in Carlsbad?
Congressman, I would commit that we will keep you apprised. Carlsbad's tough, like so many places in the West. Housing costs are going through the roof, and it's hard to recruit, but we are working on it every day.
Okay, thank you. I believe that given the importance of BLM in New Mexico, the field office, that in the COVID-19 pandemic, it's over. It's been over. There are a lot of people that are working from home still. So when we have shortages like this and people working from home, and COVID's been over for a very long time, I will also ask if your office would commit to getting these people back to working full-time to alleviate some of these numbers as well, if you don't mind.
Congressman, we are following department policy on both telework and remote, and so many of those jobs at the field level, the office is a car in the field, right? And catching up on emails either at home or at the office is a small part of the work. The work is really out on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. And lastly, just on Monday, I was in Midland, Texas. And the reason why I was in Midland is because, I don't know if you know, I'm from Houston, Texas. The entire energy corridor is in my district. The two hubs for energy are my district and Congressman August Pfluger's district in Midland. And so there are some synergies there that we are hypersensitive to and focused on. And I visited a company, and I have 3 applications here with me. This is the first one. It's roughly 7 pages. This is Texas. This is also why Texas is growing so fast, because we like to get things done in Texas. The second one is the New Mexico one. This is 41 pages. Better, but still not the Texas standard. This is BLM's APD. This is 220 pages. And I'm not trying to be insulting, but this is why companies have a very hard time when operating outside of Texas, and why America is hurting, because we have to do better than this. This incentivizes companies to want to work hard to increase their oil production that the world drastically needs. Ma'am, I'm asking you, can we please work together to get this looking more like Texas in a not so distant future?
Congressman, I'm very much interested in results, and we are producing record highs off of our public lands of oil. And I heard you last week when you said to the Secretary, but I want more. I hear you. But we are producing record highs. Why we're also upholding the law. And as you know, a lot of our work is held up in court, and I want to make sure that when we go to court, we win.
But you do understand that whenever a company sees this much bureaucracy, it does disincentivize them to try to do more. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying, but please also know that public lands are doing their part to fuel this country.
I understand. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your cooperation. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Sams, where does public safety, the safety of people, rank in terms of importance or priority in national parks policy?
Sir, turn on your microphone.
It's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific.
Thank you for the question,
Can you hear me
Congressman.
okay?
Yes, sir. It's paramount to us.
Okay, great to hear. And how about the threat of wildfires for communities near national parks?
also very paramount to us.
Great, glad to hear that. So the Park Service does have concerns if a community in a forested area would have only one escape route in the event of a wildfire. You'd be concerned about that.
We would be very concerned
Very
about
good,
that.
glad to hear. As you know, last year in Hawaii, a devastating wildfire broke out in Lahaina, and 115 people died because there was only 2 ways in and out of the town, and people were actually trying to take refuge from the flames. 5 years ago, in November of 18, the infamous Camp Fire broke out in California and resulted in 85 deaths, representing the deadliest fire in California history. At least 7 of those deaths were attributed to people being trapped in traffic jams trying to escape. And then 7 years ago, in 2017, the Tubbs Fire ignited also in California and led to a 6-lane highway being engulfed in flames, creating serious evacuation issues that resulted in 22 fatalities. Well, my district is home to the Wintergreen community in Nelson County in Virginia, which is located within the Blue Ridge National Park, and it only has one method of entry and exit for a community that has as many as 10,000 people at a time. For over 30 years, the Wintergreen Property Association has tried to obtain approval from the National Park Service to build a 400-foot long, 10 to 12 feet wide emergency gravel road to connect the only road in Wintergreen to the Blue Ridge Parkway to create an exit. Actual photo here, you can see the orange part there is the 400 feet that we need to be approved by National Park Service to connect to the Blue Ridge Parkway. Just a little orange 2-inch line there on my photo anyway. They've completed all the necessary studies confirming that little to no negative environmental impact or threat to endangered species would take place. But again, there's only one means of entry and exit for Wintergreen. The whole community's down here, and they can only go down. They can't go up at this point, which at any given time might have as many as 10,000 people. But the National Park Service has repeatedly indicated that an emergency exit connecting the Blue Ridge Parkway across National Park Service land to prevent the loss of life is likely inconsistent, quote, likely inconsistent with the use of such lands for parkway purposes, and then also cited the lack of precedent set forth under the National Park Service Organic Act. Wintergreen has, in response, proposed that the emergency exit road would be under the control of National Park Service with a gate that would remain locked at all times for a gravel road that would only ever be used, hopefully never, but only ever be used in an emergency, and again, the hope that that would never be the case. But the NPS, National Park Service, claims they have no authority to issue the permit under the National Park Service Organic Act. In December of 23, just now 5 months ago, the Wintergreen community filed their latest application. They've been trying for 30 years. Thank God it hasn't been necessary yet for an emergency exit, which is pending review. Again, you can see the diagram here. This would be a non-invasive gravel road allowed to be grown over, again, gated off under the control of NPS that would only be used in emergency. Can you answer as to why this has not been approved?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I do not know, but I will get back to you in writing about this. And thank you for bringing it to my attention. I will look into it more deeply.
I appreciate that. It would be great if it could just be approved because that would be faster. Thank you for your willingness to look at that. Both senators in Virginia have expressed their support for this to me as they have advocated for it as well. I do have a bill, the Blue Ridge Safety Act, which would more clearly grant you the authority to issue one permit a year in cases where there was an emergency. Would hope not to have to wait for the legislative will to do that through both houses of Congress and the president. It's a common sense bill that would allow Wintergreen to take these appropriate measures to ensure their safety of the community. So thank you for your commitment to look at that, and hopefully that you will support that, and hopefully we will never need to use it, and it will just be grown over with gravel underneath and be very limited invasive, but just a 400-foot access road that would prevent loss of life unnecessarily. So thank you, Director Sams, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming.
All right. Thank you. Director Stone-Manning, I have visited the disaster on our southern border 3 times, and there are millions of acres of BLM lands in our southern border states, such as New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, etc. How many times have you visited the border states to find out firsthand how the invasion of illegal aliens into our country has affected those lands?
Congresswoman, I have visited the border once.
Okay. When was that?
That was in late fall of 21.
You haven't been back?
To the border, no. To the southern states, yes.
Have you, as the director of the BLM, undertaken any type of NEPA analysis to evaluate the environmental impact of uncontrollable illegal aliens crossing the border?
Congresswoman, I think you might be talking about the garbage that we were talking about earlier in the hearing. Is that what you're referring
Nope,
to?
I'm talking about, have you undertaken any kind of an environmental analysis to determine the impact of the horde of millions of people crossing that border illegally and crossing BLM lands? Have you done any kind of an environmental analysis to determine the impact that they are having on our federal lands?
Not to my knowledge.
Does the BLM intend to start trying to find a way to house illegal aliens on our federal lands?
Congresswoman, that is not in our mission.
Just 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to question Secretary Haaland about various Wyoming priorities, and one of which is the entire Wyoming delegation has written to you about multiple times, and that relates to the Rock Springs RMP. When I asked Secretary Haaland if she had heard about it or if she was familiar with it, she stated that she had not. Director Stone-Manning, have you read the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan?
Congresswoman, I believe the next day the secretary in a subsequent
No,
hearing.
I'm asking you. The question for you is, have you read the Rock Springs RMP?
I have read the main chapters of it, but not all the appendices.
But you have not read all of it.
Not all the appendices. No, that's
Okay.
what my staff does.
In Alternative B, or in that Rock Springs RMP, the BLM chose Alternative B, which would establish over 1.8 million acres as areas of critical environmental concern, and it would impact grazing as well as oil and gas development, mining, and will lead to the end of existing leases where we have productive uses that generate revenue for the state and for the nation. It destroys recreation and vehicle access and contains all sorts of broad so-called protections that aren't relevant to protecting the environment at all. In late 2023, a former BLM employee who was actually a participant in the drafting of the Rock Springs RMP testified to Wyoming's Joint Federal Natural Resources Management Committee that the BLM's preferred alternative received very little time and effort in their development. In his own words, he said, quote, "The science and the work was all done on Alternative D, as in dog. We sat down and in 1 week, we did Alternative B and C together. And after that was done, we sat down with the cooperating agencies and we spent the next 5 or 6 years developing Alternative D," end quote. Do you think it's appropriate to completely rewrite and upend the management plan for 3.6 million acres of land based on a plan that was put together in 1 week?
Congresswoman, I can't speak to a former staffer at the BLM, but I can speak to the team in Rock Springs who was working day in and day out on that plan, and I'm
They
proud
were
of-
working on the plan, but not on Alternatives B and C.
I am, as I was saying, and I am proud of their work, and I am proud of how they are incorporating
Do
what
you
they are
believe that a
hearing.
1-week review would comply with the requirements of FLIPMA?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Do you believe that a 1-week review of a particular alternative for a resource management plan that would cover 3.6 million acres would satisfy the requirements of FLIPMA?
Congressman, we're spending more than a week on
My
this
question
plan.
is, would a 1-week review for an alternative on a plan that covers 3.6 million acres of land satisfy the requirements of FLIPMA? Clearly, the answer is not, that it wouldn't, would it?
I believe it's a hypothetical question, Congresswoman.
In the first 3 years of the Biden administration, the BLM held 4 onshore oil and gas lease sales in Wyoming totaling 194,000 acres and generated $44 million in revenue. Conversely, the Trump administration held 13 lease sales over its first 3 years, leasing 2.2 million acres and generating $431 million in revenue. The BLM has brought in 1/10 of the revenue as compared to the Trump administration, and as you know, half of that revenue goes to the state of Wyoming and half of it goes to the federal government. How do you intend to replace that kind of revenue into the coffers of the federal government if you are going to deny our ability to generate revenue on 48% of the surface estate in the state of Wyoming?
Congresswoman, there are 10 million acres that are leased in this country that are not currently being used. There are over 7,000 permits to drill that are not being used.
So the answer is you don't have an answer to that question.
Congresswoman, it's not, we have 10 million acres that are not being used, that are leased. We have 7,000 permits that are not being used that industry could use tomorrow. They're choosing
You
not
actually
to.
know so little about the industry that you don't even know how that system and process works. That's what's apparent by your answer to my question. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. So the issue of, Director Stone-Manning, the issue of FLIPMA has come up a couple times. And you're familiar with the coordination requirement in FLIPMA, right? You know how it's much different than, we hear the terms collaborate, things like that. Coordination is much different, isn't it?
Our cooperating agencies help make our work better.
But coordination, that term, is clearly defined and is much different than like just cooperating or collaborating. Isn't that correct?
Congressman, I don't think I know where you're going with this question.
Well, I'd go in this direction. So we heard from the gentleman from Guam how his constituents were not heard, that they were not included in the process. He expressed concern, and he was very mild about it and respectful, but it was clear he was saying that on the issue he had in the Mariana Islands that they were not being heard. We heard from the gentleman from Utah, not a single hearing in regards to Bears Ears, is that correct?
Congressman, regarding the gentleman from Guam, we don't manage lands on Guam. Regarding the gentleman from Utah, we held public meetings all over the West in capital cities that were easy to get to. We also held meetings online, virtually, so that people can participate from their homes.
Did you coordinate with the local municipalities?
Congressman, we work very closely with the state of Utah.
You coordinated, treated them as an equal at the table when you were doing the process. Is that what you're saying? Because coordination is a very specific item within FLIPMA that you must sit down and work with local governments, local and state governments, as equals. Did you treat them as equals?
On the Bears, I think he was referring to the Bears Ears plan and the Grand Staircase plan, and we do work with local entities to take their concerns into consideration. On the public lands rule itself, we did that work with easily 100 staffers at the Bureau whose job it is to implement and manage on the ground.
Did you fully coordinate with the governing entities in Utah, including local governments?
On the public lands rule, no, we did not. They did have a chance between draft and final, however, during a 90-day public period.
Thank you for letting us know that you did not coordinate because it is a different process than simply a hearing. I'm going to go to some testimony from Secretary Holland from a couple weeks ago, and it had to do with the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, their regulation. Didn't the tribes up there ask for an extension on the provision that you folks put in place? Didn't they ask for an extension, and weren't they denied?
Congressman, we granted 2 extensions in the public comment period for the NPRA rule.
So the tribes are lying to us, saying that they did not get the extension, because that's what they told us. They did not get an extension in a hearing here before the Natural Resources Committee.
Congressman, I can't speak for the tribes. What I can tell you is we extended the public comment period twice.
So a BLM employee said, I wish we could give an extension. In other contexts, we might have that kind of time, but I'm happy to regale you with the ins and outs of the Congressional Review Act. But unfortunately, we're on a schedule with this one that we don't have any control over. So we just don't have that kind of time for this rule as a result of denying the extension. Did you instruct your employee to say that?
Congressman, I did not instruct that colleague to say that. I can tell you that we met.
Is that employee still working for the Bureau of Land Management after making a statement like that?
Congressman, she doesn't work for the Bureau.
Did you issue any sort of directive in regards to this, whether it's formal or informal, to say that we're going to get you around the Congressional Review Act by doing this in such a manner. Did you issue any directives?
Congressman, we worked very hard on this rule and many others, and the timing is what the timing was. We've worked for the last 2.5 or 3 years on these rules, and here we are. And as you know, I don't know what the deadline is for the Congressional Review Act because it moves every year, right?
By the way, I was just handed a note. The tribe asked for 90 days. They got 30. So we hear all this happy talk from the administration, and we heard it from you today also, in regards to we are so serious about working with the tribal interests around the country. We believe in nation-to-nation collaboration and things like that. But you didn't do that in Alaska. You didn't take into account their requests. Does this administration only work with the tribes when it serves your interests and not necessarily the tribe's interests?
Congressman, I am so proud to work under the historic leadership of Secretary Holland. We engage with tribes at the department like we never have in our history. By my count, we met with folks on the North Slope 17 times. Then we had 3 public meetings on top of that. And so we listened very hard to what they say, and the final rule that we promulgated recently incorporates in part what we heard from them.
And you would not give them the extension that they wished for. A tribal interest in Alaska asked for a 90-day extension, and you did not, the Bureau of Land Management did not give that to them. Isn't that correct?
What we were able to do is continue in government-to-government tribal consultation, which is not dictated by a public comment period. So the public comment period shut down, but the government-to-government consultation continued.
You have a long history of anti-natural resource utilization in this country, both private and in public. It certainly appears that that you are continuing that in your role as the director at the Bureau of Land Management. And it's terribly unfortunate for the American people that we continue to see these types of actions that are leading to what is harming the American people at this point with inflation, higher energy prices, the denial of energy projects, and the anti-natural resources utilization mentality that exists with this administration. We see it all over the country. Americans see it all over the country, and you can deny it if you wish to, but that's not the case.
Congressman, what I am proud of is that 10,000 people who work for the BLM that I have the honor of overseeing created $232 billion in economic output last year. It's remarkable work.
And those 10,000 people are harming 300 million in the United States of America. I'd like to thank both the witnesses for your testimony and members for your questions. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for our witnesses today, and we will ask that the witnesses respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the subcommittee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on Monday, May 20th, 2024. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the Subcommittee on Federal Lands stands adjourned.